The red light district of Chapeltown in Leeds was quiet on the night of October the 30th, 1975, the streets wet with rain that had been falling steadily since afternoon, the kind of cold autumn rain that emptied the pavements and sent people indoors. It made even the women who worked the streets seek shelter in doorways and under awnings, waiting for cars to slow and for windows to roll down, and for the brief negotiations that would lead to money changing hands and to movement toward darker places where transactions could be completed away from streetlights and from the eyes of passing patrol cars. Wilma McCann was 28 years old, mother of 4 children, working as a prostitute because the money from social assistance was not enough to feed her family, because her marriage had failed and she was alone with responsibilities that required income she could not earn through the limited legitimate employment available to working-class women with children and without education or training. She had been drinking that evening, had spent time in pubs in Chapeltown, had spoken with friends and with other women who worked the same streets, had left around 1:30 in the morning to walk home through Prince Philip playing fields, a route that cut through darkness but that shortened the journey, that was familiar, and that she'd walked many times before without incident. She never arrived home. Her body was found the following morning by a man walking his dog across the playing fields, found lying on grass approximately 100 yards from the path, found with her clothing disarranged, found with massive head injuries that had been inflicted with a hammer, found with stab wounds to her chest and abdomen that had been made with a screwdriver or similar implement, found in circumstances that left no doubt this was murder, that someone had attacked her with extraordinary violence, that she had been killed not in a sudden rage but with sustained brutality that suggested the killer had continued striking and stabbing long after she was dead. The murder investigation began immediately, but produced few leads and fewer results. Wilma had been seen earlier in the evening, but no one had witnessed the attack. No one had seen her with anyone suspicious. No one could provide descriptions that would help identify a suspect. The murder weapon was not recovered from the scene. There were no witnesses, no forensic evidence that would prove useful in 1975 when DNA analysis did not exist, and when forensic science was limited to blood typing and to examination of physical evidence that in this case was minimal and unhelpful. The investigation went cold within weeks. The murder remained unsolved. Wilma McCann became another statistic, another dead prostitute in a city where such deaths attracted limited attention and generated minimal public concern. But Wilma McCann was not just another victim. She was the first woman to die at the hands of Peter William Sutcliffe, a truck driver from Bradford who would kill 12 more women over the next 5 years, who would attack at least 7 others who survived, who would terrorise northern England and particularly West Yorkshire, who would create panic among women and fury at police who seemed unable to catch him despite massive investigation and despite eventually interviewing Sutcliffe 9 times without recognising him as the killer they were seeking. The Yorkshire Ripper, as the press would name him in deliberate echo of Jack the Ripper, would become one of Britain's most notorious serial killers, would kill women with hammers and knives and screwdrivers, would attack prostitutes primarily, but would also kill women who were not prostitutes, would demonstrate that no woman was safe when walking alone after dark in West Yorkshire, would expose failures in police investigation that would lead to reforms and recriminations, would raise questions about class and about how society valued different lives, about why murders of prostitutes generated less urgency than murders of so-called respectable women, about systemic problems that allowed a serial killer to operate for 5 years despite being known to police, despite being questioned repeatedly, despite evidence that should have identified him long before his eventual arrest in January 1981. The rain continued falling on Chapeltown that October night in 1975, washed away evidence, made the investigation more difficult, contributed to the failure to identify the killer who had claimed his first victim and who would claim many more before he was finally stopped. Wilma McCann lay dead on the grass while her killer drove away into the darkness, returned to his home in Bradford, returned to his wife and his ordinary life as a truck driver, carried within him whatever drove him to kill, whatever allowed him to bludgeon and stab a woman to death, and then to go home and to sleep and to wake the next day and to continue living as though nothing had happened, as though he had not crossed the line from ordinary man to murderer, as though the violence was separate from his daily existence rather than being expression of something fundamental in his character. The story of the Yorkshire Ripper would unfold over 5 years, would claim 13 lives and would devastate many more, would change how Britain thought about serial murder and about police investigation, would leave scars on families and on communities that would persist for decades after Sutcliffe's arrest and conviction. But on October the 30th, 1975, as Wilma McCann's body cooled in the rain, the story was just beginning. The pattern was not yet visible, the terror had not yet begun, and Peter Sutcliffe was still just a truck driver living in Bradford, still capable of being stopped before he killed again, still within reach of a justice system that would fail, repeatedly to identify him until 12 more women were dead and until fear had paralysed an entire region. The playing fields fell silent except for the rain. The city slept unaware that a serial killer had begun his work. And somewhere in the darkness, Peter Sutcliffe prepared for the next time, for the next victim, for the continuation of a campaign of violence that would define him and that would haunt Britain for generations to come. Chapter 1. The Truck Driver. From Bradford. Good evening and welcome back to the Bedside Historian. The night has found you wherever you are, and I hope you are settled in comfort and in safety, in a place where the darkness feels peaceful rather than threatening, where the quiet brings rest rather than fear. Tonight we journey not to distant centuries or to foreign lands, but to recent history, to events that occurred within living memory, to crimes that shaped modern Britain and that changed how we understand serial murder and police investigation, to 5 years of terror in Yorkshire, when women were hunted in the streets and when a killer operated with impunity despite massive investigation, despite being questioned repeatedly, despite evidence that should have identified him long before his eventual arrest. Before we descend into this story of violence and investigative failure, of lives destroyed and opportunities missed, I invite you to subscribe to this channel if you have not already done so. These narratives require careful research, sensitive handling of recent tragedy, respect for victims and their families who may still be living, hours spent examining police records and trial transcripts and contemporary accounts. Your support allows this work to continue, allows these important stories to be told with the accuracy and the gravity they deserve. Now then, where are you listening from tonight? What hour finds you? Is it late evening where you are, the day finished and the night stretching ahead? Or perhaps it is the deep hours when sleep proves elusive and history provides companionship in the darkness? Wherever you are, whatever brings you to this story, settle in, let the present recede. And let us travel together to West Yorkshire in the 1970s, to an era of industrial decline and social change, to cities like Bradford and Leeds, where working-class communities struggled with unemployment and poverty, where prostitution flourished because economic desperation drove women to sell sex, where a man named Peter William Sutcliffe would begin a campaign of murder that would claim 13 lives and that would expose profound failures in how police investigated serial crime. Peter William Sutcliffe was born on June 2nd, 1946, in Bingley, a small town near Bradford in West Yorkshire, the first child of John and Kathleen Sutcliffe. Born into a working-class family that was unremarkable in almost every way, that struggled financially but that was stable and functional, that provided childhood that was ordinary if not particularly happy, that offered no obvious explanation for why their son would become a serial killer who murdered 13 women over 5 years. The Sutcliffe family eventually included 6 children, with Peter being the oldest, bearing the expectations and the responsibilities that came with that position. Growing up in circumstances that were typical for working-class families in northern England in the 1950s and 60s, Peter's childhood was characterised by shyness and by social awkwardness, by difficulty making friends and by preference for solitary activities, by sensitivity that made him vulnerable to bullying and to teasing that he endured from classmates and from peers who sensed his weakness and who exploited it in the way that children often do. He was not athletic, was not popular, was not successful in the social hierarchies that characterised school life, found himself on the margins of his peer group, developed patterns of isolation and resentment that would persist into adulthood and that would contribute to the rage that would eventually express itself through violence against women. His relationship with his mother was close, perhaps excessively so, with Kathleen being protective of her sensitive oldest son, shielding him from his father's rougher temperament, creating dynamic where Peter identified more with his mother than with masculine models that might have helped him develop confidence and social skills. His father John was a mill worker, was practical and direct, had limited patience for Peter's sensitivity, created tension in the household that would increase as Peter grew older and as the differences between them became more apparent. Peter's education was unremarkable. He attended local schools, achieved mediocre results, showed no particular aptitude or interest in academic subjects, left school at age 15 as was common for working-class boys in 1961, entered the workforce in series of manual labour jobs that required minimal training and that offered minimal prospects for advancement. He worked as a gravedigger for a period, a job that some would later find significant given his future crimes, that exposed him to death and to bodies, that perhaps contributed to whatever psychological process was developing that would eventually allow him to kill without apparent remorse. The work as a gravedigger was temporary, was one of several jobs Peter held during his late teens and early 20s as he drifted through employment that was available to young men without education or training in northern England's declining industrial economy. He eventually found more stable work as a truck driver, a job that suited his solitary temperament, that required minimal social interaction, that allowed him to spend hours alone in his vehicle driving through Yorkshire and beyond, that provided income that was adequate for a working-class man, that gave him the independence and the mobility that would later facilitate his murders. In 1967, at age 21, Peter met Sonia Surma at a local dance, began a courtship that would last 7 years before they married in 1974. Sonia was the daughter of Czech and Ukrainian immigrants, was educated and ambitious in ways that Peter was not, had trained as a teacher, represented upward mobility and respectability that Peter aspired to, but that he could not fully achieve given his limited education and his working-class background. The relationship was troubled from the beginning, was characterized by jealousy on Peter's part and by controlling behavior that would intensify after marriage, by Sonia's mental health problems that would eventually require hospitalization, by tensions and conflicts that created unstable domestic environment. The long courtship before marriage was marked by periods of separation and reconciliation, by Peter's possessive jealousy whenever Sonia showed interest in other activities or other people, by his demands for her complete attention and loyalty, by patterns of control that were warning signs of the violence that would later emerge. Sonia suffered a mental breakdown during this period, was diagnosed with schizophrenia, was hospitalized for treatment, emerged from the crisis changed and perhaps more vulnerable, married Peter in August 1974 despite the problems in their relationship, despite the warning signs that should have suggested the marriage would not be healthy or stable. The marriage was childless, whether by choice or by circumstance is not entirely clear from available records, but the absence of children meant that Peter and Sonia lived alone together in a house in Bradford, created domestic situation that was isolated and that was characterized by tension and by Sonia's mental health struggles and by Peter's growing obsessions with prostitutes and with violence. Peter began visiting red light districts in Bradford and Leeds during the early years of his marriage, began picking up prostitutes not for sex but to observe them, to follow them, to fantasize about violence against them, to develop the patterns that would eventually lead to murder. The transformation from fantasy to action, from thinking about violence to actually committing it, occurred gradually during 1974 and 1975 as Peter's visits to red light districts became more frequent and as his fantasies became more elaborate and more violent. He began carrying weapons, began carrying a hammer that he claimed was for self-defense, but that was actually preparation for attack, began following specific women, began creating opportunities for violence even if he had not yet acted on those opportunities. The psychological progression from fantasy to preparation to action is characteristic of serial killers, represents a process where inhibitions are gradually overcome, where the idea killing becomes normalized through repeated mental rehearsal, where the actual act of murder becomes almost inevitable once the psychological barriers have been sufficiently eroded. Peter's first known attack on a woman occurred in July 1975, several months before Wilma McCann's murder, when he struck a woman named Anna Rogulski with a hammer in Keighley, but was interrupted before he could kill her. Anna survived the attack, reported it to police, provided a description of her attacker and of his car, gave information that should have been useful, but that was not connected to later attacks, because the investigation was not coordinated, and because the significance of the attack was not recognized at the time. Peter had crossed the line from fantasy to action, had attempted murder even if the attempt was unsuccessful, had learned from the experience, had refined his method, had prepared for the next attempt that would occur 3 months later with Wilma McCann, and that would be successful. The period between the attack on Anna Rogulski and the murder of Wilma McCann was crucial in Peter's psychological development as a killer. It was the time when he processed what had happened during the failed attack, when he considered what had gone wrong and how to avoid being interrupted in future attacks, when he prepared himself mentally and practically for murder rather than for merely assault. He obtained additional weapons, acquired knives and screwdrivers that he would use to stab victims after bludgeoning them with hammers, created a toolkit for murder that he carried in his car that allowed him to kill efficiently and brutally, that demonstrated planning and intent rather than impulsive violence. The choice to target prostitutes was deliberate, and was based partly on opportunity and partly on Peter's attitudes toward women and toward sexuality. He later claimed that he heard voices commanding him to kill prostitutes, that God had given him a mission to cleanse the streets of immoral women, that his murders were righteous acts rather than crimes. But this religious justification was almost certainly constructed after the fact, was explanation that served his interest during trial, when diminished responsibility was his defense strategy, was not supported by his actual behavior, which demonstrated careful planning and deliberate target selection rather than the confused actions of someone driven by delusions. The reality was probably that Peter targeted prostitutes because they were vulnerable, because they would get into cars with strange men, because their disappearances would generate less police attention than disappearances of other women, because their deaths would be attributed to the dangerous nature of their work rather than being recognized immediately as serial murders. He also targeted them because he hated them, because he resented their sexuality and their power to attract men, because killing them allowed him to assert control and dominance in ways that his ordinary life did not permit, because violence against prostitutes could be rationalized as morally justified in ways that violence against other women could not. Peter's life in the months before Wilma McCann's murder was outwardly ordinary, was characterized by work as a truck driver and by marriage to Sonia, and by social interactions with family and with the few friends he maintained. No one who knew him casually would have suspected that he was preparing to commit murder, that he was carrying weapons in his car, that he was spending his free time cruising red light districts and planning attacks. The mask of normality was complete and was convincing, was maintained throughout his 5 years of killing, was one of the reasons that police failed to identify him despite interviewing him repeatedly, because he seemed like an ordinary working-class man rather than like a serial killer. But beneath the surface of ordinary life, Peter Sutcliffe was transforming into someone capable of extraordinary violence, was nurturing hatreds and resentments that would find expression through murder, was preparing to begin a campaign of killing that would terrorize Yorkshire and that would expose fundamental weaknesses in how British police investigated serial crime. The truck driver from Bradford was about to become the Yorkshire Ripper, was about to claim his first victim in Wilma McCann, was about to begin 5 years of terror that would end only when chance, rather than competent investigation, finally brought him into custody. The ordinary life in Bradford continued. The marriage to Sonia continued despite its problems. The work driving trucks continued providing income and providing cover for absences that would later be recognised as corresponding to murder dates. Peter Sutcliffe maintained his double existence, was husband and worker and neighbour during the day, was predator and killer during the night, moved between these identities with apparent ease that suggested profound psychological compartmentalisation, that demonstrated his ability to separate his violent impulses from his ordinary interactions, that allowed him to kill and then to return home and to sleep and to wake and to continue as though nothing had happened. The Yorkshire Ripper had not yet acquired his name, had not yet generated the terror that would define the late 1970s, had not yet demonstrated the pattern that would eventually make clear that a serial killer was operating. But the foundation had been laid, the psychological preparation was complete, the weapons were ready, the targets had been selected, and Peter Sutcliffe was prepared to kill, was waiting only for the right opportunity, for the right victim, for the right circumstances that would allow him to act on impulses that had been building for months, or perhaps for years. Chapter 2. The First Victims. The murder of Wilma McCann on October the 30th, 1975, marked the beginning of the Yorkshire Ripper's campaign but was not recognised as such at the time, was treated as an isolated killing of a prostitute, was investigated but without the urgency or the resources that would later be devoted to the case once the pattern became clear. Wilma's body was discovered on the morning of October the 31st by a milkman taking a shortcut across Prince Philip playing fields in Leeds, found lying on grass approximately 100 yards from the nearest path, found with her coat and her blouse pulled up, found with massive trauma to her head from repeated hammer blows, found with 14 stab wounds to her chest and abdomen, inflicted with a screwdriver or similar sharp implement. The post-mortem examination revealed the extent of the violence that had been inflicted on Wilma, documented skull fractures from at least 2 separate blows to the head, documented stab wounds that had penetrated vital organs, established that death had resulted from the combination of head trauma and blood loss from the stab wounds, confirmed that the attack had been sustained and brutal rather than being a single blow followed by flight. The pathologist who conducted the examination noted the pattern of injuries, noted that the head wounds suggested use of a hammer or similar blunt instrument, noted that the stab wounds appeared to have been inflicted with methodical precision rather than in frenzy, noted details that would later prove significant when compared to subsequent murders, but that at the time was simply part of documenting a single homicide. The investigation into Wilma's murder was conducted by Leeds police, was led by detectives who had experience with homicides but who had no reason to believe this was anything other than a one-off killing, probably by a client or by someone Wilma had encountered during her night of drinking and walking. The investigation followed standard procedures, interviewed people who had seen Wilma earlier in the evening, attempted to trace her movements from the last confirmed sighting to the location where her body was found, looked for witnesses who might have seen her with someone, or who might have noticed suspicious vehicles or suspicious activity in the area of the playing fields. But the investigation produced minimal results, found no witnesses to the actual attack, found no forensic evidence that would identify a suspect, recovered no murder weapons from the scene or from surrounding areas despite extensive searches, developed no strong leads that would point toward any specific individual. Wilma had been seen in various pubs earlier in the evening, had been seen alone and had been seen talking with several different men, but none of these sightings led anywhere useful. None of the men could be identified or located. None of the information gathered provided clear direction for the investigation. The case went cold within weeks, remained open but inactive, became another unsolved murder in files that contained too many similar cases, too many dead prostitutes whose killings generated limited attention and limited resources. Peter Sutcliffe had committed his first successful murder, had bludgeoned and stabbed Wilma McCann to death, had left her body in the playing fields and had driven away undetected, had returned to his home in Bradford approximately 10 miles away, had gone to sleep beside his wife Sonia, had awakened the next morning to news reports about the discovery of a woman's body in Leeds, but had given no outward sign of involvement or of concern. He had crossed the threshold from attempted murder to successful murder, had proven to himself that he could kill and escape detection, had demonstrated that the fantasy and the planning could be translated into action, had begun the pattern that would continue for 5 years and that would claim 12 more victims. The interval between Wilma's murder in October 1975 and the second murder in January 1976 was approximately 3 months, was a period during which Peter apparently did not attack anyone, during which he processed what he had done and prepared for the next killing, during which he continued his ordinary life while carrying within him the knowledge that he had killed and the intention to kill again. The gap between murders would vary throughout his campaign, sometimes being only weeks and sometimes being months, following no predictable pattern, making it difficult for investigators to anticipate when the next attack might occur or where it might take place. Emily Jackson was 42 years old, married with 3 children, working as a prostitute to supplement family income that was insufficient to meet their needs, engaging in sex work secretly, without her family knowing the full extent of her activities. She was last seen alive on January 20th, 1976, in the Chapeltown area of Leeds, the same red light district where Wilma McCann had worked. Getting into a vehicle with a man who witnesses could not describe clearly because it was dark and because the encounter was brief and unremarkable in an area where such encounters occurred constantly. Her body was found the following morning in an alley off Sheepscar Street in Leeds, found lying on her back with her clothing disarranged, found with massive head trauma from hammer blows, found with 51 stab wounds to her chest and abdomen and back and thighs, found with injuries that were even more extensive than those inflicted on Wilma McCann, that suggested escalating violence, that demonstrated the killer's willingness to spend time with victims after death, mutilating them in ways that went far beyond what was necessary to cause death. The post-mortem examination of Emily Jackson's body revealed the extraordinary brutality of the attack, documented skull fractures from multiple hammer blows, documented stab wounds that had been inflicted with a screwdriver, and that showed a pattern, suggesting the killer had stamped on the handle of the implement to drive it deeper into Emily's body, documented injuries that proved the attack had continued long after death had occurred, that the killer had been engaged in violence for its own sake rather than violence as means to an end. The pathologist noted similarities to the Wilma McCann murder, noted the use of hammer and sharp implement, noted the pattern of head wounds followed by stabbing, noted details that suggested the same killer might have committed both murders. the Leeds police investigating Emily Jackson's murder recognised the similarities to Wilma McCann's murder, began to consider the possibility that the same person had killed both women, began to coordinate investigation efforts that had previously been separate, began to develop theory that a serial killer might be operating in the Leeds area targeting prostitutes. But the evidence remained limited. The forensic science available in 1976 was insufficient to develop strong leads from the crime scenes. The witness statements were vague and contradictory. The investigation struggled to make progress despite increasing concern that more murders would occur if the killer was not identified and apprehended. The press coverage of Emily Jackson's murder was more extensive than the coverage of Wilma McCann's murder had been, partly because this was now the second similar killing, and partly because the brutality of the attack generated sensational headlines and public interest. The newspapers reported the details of the injuries, described the red light district where the murder had occurred, began to characterize the killer as someone who was targeting prostitutes, began to create narrative that would eventually coalesce around the name Yorkshire Ripper, even though that name would not be applied until later, when more murders had occurred and when the pattern was undeniable. Peter Sutcliffe had killed again, had demonstrated that the first murder was not an isolated incident but was beginning of a campaign, had shown through the increased violence inflicted on Emily Jackson that his bloodlust was intensifying rather than being satisfied by the killings, that each murder seemed to require more violence to provide whatever satisfaction he was seeking. He had again escaped detection, had again returned to his ordinary life in Bradford, had again given no outward sign that he was the killer, being sought by police, had maintained the mask of normality that would characterize his entire period of active killing. The two murders established the pattern that would define the Yorkshire Ripper case, established that the killer targeted prostitutes working in red light districts, that he used hammer and sharp implements, that he killed with extraordinary brutality, that he was willing to spend time with bodies after death inflicting additional injuries, that he was operating in the Leeds area, that he was likely driving a vehicle since the murders occurred in locations that would be difficult to reach on foot, and since witnesses had seen victims getting into cars shortly before their bodies were discovered. The pattern was visible to investigators who were paying attention, but the significance of the pattern was not yet fully appreciated. The urgency that would later characterize the investigation was not yet present. The massive resources that would eventually be devoted to catching the Ripper had not yet been mobilized. The investigation continued through early 1976, followed leads that went nowhere, interviewed suspects who were eliminated, struggled with the limitations of available evidence and available technology, failed to identify Peter Sutcliffe despite the fact that he was living and working in the area where the murders had occurred, despite the fact that he fit general descriptions that witnesses had provided, despite the fact that he was exactly the kind of ordinary working-class man that investigators should have been considering as a possible suspect. The failure to identify Sutcliffe early in the investigation would prove catastrophic, would allow him to continue killing for another 5 years, would result in 11 more deaths that might have been prevented if the investigation had been more competent or more fortunate in its early stages. The first two victims had been killed, had been murdered with extraordinary violence, had been left in locations where they would be discovered quickly, had generated investigation that was extensive but ineffective, had established patterns that should have made subsequent murders predictable and preventable, but that did not because the investigation was hampered by assumptions about victims and by limitations of forensic science, and by simple bad luck that allowed Peter Sutcliffe to remain unidentified, despite growing evidence that pointed towards someone very much like him. Wilma McCann and Emily Jackson were the beginning, were the first names in a list that would eventually include 13 women, were the victims whose murders set in motion investigation that would consume thousands of hours of police work and that would ultimately fail to prevent the additional murders that would occur over the next 5 years. Their deaths marked the emergence of the Yorkshire Ripper, marked the beginning of a reign of terror that would change how Britain thought about serial murder and about violence against women, that would expose class prejudices and investigative failures, that would leave scars on families and communities that would persist for decades after Peter Sutcliffe's eventual arrest and conviction. Chapter 3. The Ripper emerges. The year 1977 marked the transformation of the Yorkshire murders from a series of brutal but relatively contained killings into a national crisis, from a police investigation into a public panic, from unnamed murders into the reign of the Yorkshire Ripper, whose name would dominate headlines and whose shadow would fall across northern England for the next 4 years. The year would see 4 murders and multiple attacks, would demonstrate that the killer was accelerating his campaign, would prove that no woman in West Yorkshire was truly safe, would generate the massive police response that should have occurred earlier, but that had been delayed by assumptions about victims and by failures to recognise the scope of the threat. The first murder of 1977 occurred on February 5th, when Irene Richardson's body was found in Roundhay Park in Leeds, found with the same pattern of injuries that had characterised the previous murders, found with massive head trauma from hammer blows and with stab wounds to the abdomen and throat, found in circumstances that left no doubt this was the same killer who had murdered Wilma McCann and Emily Jackson. Irene was 28 years old, was working as a prostitute, fit the victim profile that was now becoming clear, had been killed with the same extraordinary violence that had characterised the earlier murders, had been left in a public park where her body would be discovered quickly rather than being concealed. The investigation into Irene Richardson's murder was conducted with more urgency than the previous investigations had been, was coordinated with the earlier cases under assumption that the same killer was responsible, was supported by additional resources as Leeds police began to recognise that they were dealing with a serial killer rather than with isolated incidents. The murder scene was examined thoroughly, witnesses were interviewed extensively, forensic evidence was collected and analysed, with the best techniques available in 1977. But the results were similar to the previous investigations. Minimal useful evidence, no clear suspects, no breakthrough that would identify the killer despite the increased effort being devoted to the case. 2 months later, on April the 23rd, Patricia Atkinson was found murdered in her flat in Bradford, marking the first time the killer had struck in Bradford, rather than in Leeds, demonstrating that his hunting ground was expanding beyond a single city, that he was willing to travel and to operate in different locations, that the threat extended across West Yorkshire rather than being confined to Leeds. Patricia was 32 years old, was working as a prostitute, had brought her killer to her home rather than being attacked in a public location, had been murdered with the same hammer and stabbing pattern that had characterised all the previous attacks, had been left in her bed in circumstances that suggested the killer had spent time in the flat after the murder before leaving. The Bradford location of Patricia Atkinson's murder complicated the investigation, required coordination between Leeds and Bradford police forces, created jurisdictional questions about which force had primary responsibility, introduced additional bureaucratic complexity into an investigation that was already struggling with the challenge of tracking a serial killer across multiple crime scenes. The coordination problems would persist throughout the investigation, would contribute to failures in information sharing and in suspect tracking, would allow Peter Sutcliffe to be interviewed by different police forces without those interviews being properly coordinated or analysed, would represent one of many systemic failures that allowed the Ripper to continue operating for so long. The murder that would prove to be the turning point in public perception and in media coverage occurred on June 26th, when 16-year-old Jane MacDonald was found dead in an adventure playground in Leeds, found with the same pattern of hammer and stab wounds that had characterised all the previous murders, but different from the previous victims in one crucial respect. Jane was not a prostitute, was a respectable working-class girl who had been walking home from a night out with friends, was attacked simply because she was in the wrong place at the wrong time, was killed not because of her occupation or her lifestyle, but because she was a woman alone after dark in Leeds, and because the Ripper had encountered her and had seen opportunity to kill. The murder of Jane MacDonald generated unprecedented media coverage and public outrage, created panic among women across Yorkshire who now understood that the Ripper did not confine himself to attacking prostitutes, that any woman walking alone after dark was potentially at risk, that the threat extended beyond the red light districts to include respectable neighbourhoods and ordinary circumstances. The newspapers gave extensive coverage to Jane's murder, published her photograph, described her as an innocent victim in ways that implicitly characterised the previous victims as somehow less innocent because they had been prostitutes, created narrative that revealed profound class prejudices and moral judgments about which victims deserved sympathy and which deserved less. The police response to Jane MacDonald's murder was intense and immediate, represented the mobilisation of resources that should have occurred after the earlier murders, but that had been delayed because the victims had been prostitutes whose deaths generated less public concern and less political pressure to solve the cases. The investigation was expanded dramatically. Additional detectives were assigned to what was now called the Ripper Squad. Coordination between different police forces was formalised. The case became the highest priority for West Yorkshire police, consumed resources and attention that dwarfed what had been devoted to the investigation during the previous 2 years. It was during this period, in the aftermath of Jane MacDonald's murder, that the press began regularly using the name Yorkshire Ripper to describe the killer, drawing deliberate parallel to Jack the Ripper, who had terrorised Whitechapel nearly 90 years earlier, creating brand that would stick and that would define the case in public consciousness, that would contribute to the atmosphere of terror and to the pressure on police to catch the killer before he struck again. The name was catchy and was evocative, served the media's interests in selling newspapers and in maintaining public attention, but also served to elevate the killer to a kind of legendary status, to make him into a figure of dark fascination rather than simply a criminal who needed to be caught and prosecuted. Peter Sutcliffe killed again on October 1st, when Jean Jordan's body was found in Manchester, found more than a week after her murder, found after Peter had returned to the body to attempt to remove evidence, found in circumstances that provided more clues than any of the previous murders had provided, but that still did not lead directly to his identification. Jean was 20 years old, was working as a prostitute, was picked up by Peter in Manchester, which was outside his normal hunting area in West Yorkshire, was killed with the same hammer pattern, but was treated differently after death because Peter had paid her with a new £5 note that he realised could be traced, prompting his return to the body days later to attempt to retrieve the note from her purse. The discovery of the £5 note in Jean Jordan's possession was potentially the breakthrough the investigation needed, was evidence that could be traced because new £5 notes had been issued only to certain banks and businesses, could narrow the suspect pool dramatically by identifying which employees of those banks and businesses were potential suspects. The investigation traced the note to a bank in Bradford that served primarily local businesses, identified employees who had received wages paid partially in new £5 notes, created a list of suspects that included Peter Sutcliffe, who worked for a haulage firm that banked at the relevant branch and that had paid wages using the new notes. Peter was interviewed as part of this investigation, was questioned about his movements and about whether he had been in Manchester, provided explanations for his presence in areas where murders had occurred, talked his way through the interview without raising sufficient suspicion to warrant further investigation, was eliminated as a suspect despite the fact that he fit the profile, and despite the fact that the £5 note created direct link between him and Jean Jordan's murder. The failure to arrest Peter based on the £5 note evidence was one of many missed opportunities that would characterise the investigation, was a failure that would allow him to continue killing, that would result in additional deaths that might have been prevented if the investigation had been more thorough or more sceptical of Peter's explanations. The year 1977 ended with 4 murders, with escalating panic, with a massive police investigation that had consumed thousands of hours and that had generated mountains of paperwork, but that had not identified the killer, with women across Yorkshire living in fear, with the Yorkshire Ripper having achieved a kind of infamy that made him one of Britain's most wanted criminals, despite the fact that police still did not know his name or his face or where he lived, or what he did for a living. The investigation had interviewed thousands of suspects, had followed up on thousands of tips from the public, had deployed resources that were unprecedented for British policing at the time, but had failed to catch Peter Sutcliffe despite having interviewed him, despite having connected him to physical evidence, despite having multiple opportunities to recognise him as the killer they were seeking. The emergence of the Yorkshire Ripper as a national phenomenon, as a source of terror and fascination, as a challenge to police competence, and as a symbol of danger to women, had been completed during 1977. The name had been established, the pattern had been recognised, the investigation had been mobilised, but the killer remained free, remained unknown, remained capable of continuing his campaign of murder into 1978 and beyond, remained one step ahead of an investigation that was massive but ineffective, that was well-intentioned but hampered by systemic failures and by bad luck, and by the simple fact that Peter Sutcliffe was good at maintaining his mask of normality, was able to talk to police without arousing suspicion, was able to continue living his double life as ordinary truck driver and as serial killer without the two identities colliding in ways that would expose him. Chapter 4. The Hoax that Diverted Justice. The investigation into the Yorkshire Ripper murders was already struggling with the challenge of tracking a serial killer across multiple jurisdictions when it was derailed completely by what would become one of the most catastrophic failures in British criminal investigation history, a failure that would cost additional lives, that would divert massive resources toward pursuing a phantom suspect, that would allow Peter Sutcliffe to continue killing because he did not match the profile created by a hoaxer who was not the Ripper, but who police became convinced was the real killer. The hoax began in March 1978, when the first letter claiming to be from the Yorkshire Ripper was received by Assistant Chief Constable George Oldfield, who was leading the Ripper investigation for West Yorkshire Police. The letter was written in a distinctive hand, used language that seemed consistent with someone from the northeast of England, contained details about some of the murders that might have been known to the killer or that might have been available from press coverage, signed itself Jack the Ripper, in deliberate echo of the Victorian murders, taunted police about their inability to catch him, promised that he would kill again and challenged them to stop him. George Oldfield took the letter seriously, authorised analysis of the handwriting and of the content, began to consider whether this might be genuine communication from the killer, or whether it was simply one of many hoax letters that high-profile cases inevitably generated from attention seekers and from people with various psychological needs to insert themselves into investigations. The analysis was inconclusive, could not definitively prove or disprove authenticity, left the investigation in position of having to decide whether to devote resources to following up on the letter or whether to dismiss it as likely hoax, and to continue pursuing other lines of inquiry. The decision became more difficult when a second letter arrived in March 1979, more than a year after the first, containing additional details about murders, repeating the taunts and the challenges, maintaining the same handwriting and the same tone, suggesting either that the first letter had been genuine or that the hoaxer was persistent and was committed to maintaining the deception. The second letter generated more attention within the investigation, was analysed more carefully, was compared to known facts about the murders to determine whether the writer possessed information that only the killer could have known or whether everything in the letters could have been gleaned from press coverage or from logical inference. But the catastrophic failure came in June 1979 when a cassette tape was received at police headquarters, a tape that contained a voice claiming to be the Yorkshire Ripper, speaking an accent that was clearly from Sunderland in the northeast of England, approximately 100 miles from the main murder locations in West Yorkshire, delivering a message that was similar in tone to the letters, taunting police, claiming credit for the murders, challenging investigators to catch him. The voice was analysed by linguistic experts who confirmed it was genuine Sunderland accent, who identified specific characteristics that pinpointed the speaker as coming from a very particular area of that city, who provided analysis that seemed to confirm this was authentic communication from the killer. George Oldfield became convinced that the tape was genuine, that the voice on the recording was the voice of the Yorkshire Ripper, that the investigation should focus on finding the man with the Sunderland accent who had written the letters and recorded the tape. The decision to pursue this line of inquiry was supported by senior police leadership, was based on the linguistic analysis that seemed convincing, was driven by desperation to develop new leads in an investigation that had stalled, despite massive effort, was influenced by Oldfield's personal investment in the case and his belief that the tape represented breakthrough the investigation needed. The tape was played at press conferences, was broadcast on television and radio, was distributed widely in hopes that someone would recognise the voice, that the publicity would generate tips that would identify the speaker, that the distinctive Sunderland accent would make recognition easier and would narrow the suspect pool to manageable numbers. The public response was enormous, generated thousands of tips from people who thought they recognised the voice or who wanted to report suspicious persons with Sunderland accents, created massive workload for investigators who had to follow up on every tip, who had to interview countless suspects, who devoted enormous resources to pursuing leads that all proved to be dead ends. But the most catastrophic effect of the hoax was not the wasted resources or the false leads, but rather the way it narrowed the investigation's focus and eliminated suspects who did not match the hoaxer's characteristics. The investigation developed a profile based on the letters and the tape, determined that the Ripper was a man from Sunderland with distinctive accent, was someone who had access to detailed information about the murders, was someone who had the psychological profile that matched the taunting nature of the communications. This profile was used to evaluate suspects, to determine who should be investigated thoroughly and who could be eliminated quickly, to guide the entire direction of the investigation in ways that would prove disastrous. Peter Sutcliffe was interviewed by police in July 1979, was questioned about his movements and about his vehicle which had been seen in red light districts, was asked whether he could account for his whereabouts on various murder dates, provided explanations that were plausible, or at least not immediately disprovable, was evaluated against the hoaxer's profile and was eliminated as a suspect because he did not have a Sunderland accent, because his handwriting did not match the letters, because he did not fit the profile that had been developed based on the hoax communications. The interview lasted perhaps an hour, was one of 9 times Peter would be questioned by police during the investigation, was treated as routine elimination of a suspect rather than a serious investigation of someone who actually was the killer, was allowed to end with Peter walking away free to kill again because he did not match a profile that had been created by someone who was not the Ripper. The hoax was eventually exposed as fraud, was revealed to have been the work of John Humble, a man from Sunderland who had no connection to the murders, who had written the letters and recorded the tape for reasons that were never entirely clear, but that seemed to involve attention-seeking and desire to insert himself into a famous case, who had successfully deceived police and had diverted the investigation for more than a year, who had indirectly contributed to additional murders that occurred while police were pursuing him rather than pursuing the actual killer. Humble would not be identified and arrested until 2005, more than 25 years after the hoax, when advances in DNA analysis allowed his saliva from the envelope flaps to be matched to his profile in the criminal database when he was finally held accountable for the devastation his hoax had caused. The impact of the hoax on the investigation cannot be overstated, represented one of the most significant failures in British criminal investigation history, demonstrated how a single piece of false information could derail an entire inquiry, showed how confirmation bias and desperation for leads could cause experienced investigators to accept evidence that should have been questioned more skeptically. The hoax cost lives, allowed Peter Sutcliffe to continue killing because he was eliminated as a suspect based on criteria that had nothing to do with the actual Ripper, diverted resources and attention away from productive lines of inquiry, created false confidence that the investigation was making progress when in reality it was pursuing someone who had never killed anyone. The murders continued during the period when the investigation was focused on finding the man with the Sunderland accent, continued because Peter Sutcliffe did not match the hoaxer's profile and was therefore not considered a serious suspect despite being interviewed multiple times, despite his vehicle being connected to murder locations, despite his presence in red light districts being documented, despite multiple opportunities to recognize him as the killer if the investigation had not been so completely focused on finding someone who sounded like the tape and who wrote like the letters. In April 1979, Josephine Whittaker was murdered in Halifax, was attacked while walking home across Savile Park, was killed with the same hammer and stabbing pattern that characterized all the Ripper murders, was 19 years old and was a building society clerk, was emphatically not a prostitute, was another victim who demonstrated that the Ripper was not confining himself to attacking sex workers, that any woman alone after dark was at risk. Josephine's murder generated enormous public attention, created additional pressure on police to solve the cases, contributed to the atmosphere of terror that was paralysing women across Yorkshire. But the investigation remained focused on finding the man from Sunderland, remained convinced that the hoaxer was the real killer, despite the mounting evidence that the profile was wrong. In September 1979, Barbara Leach was murdered in Bradford, was a 20-year-old university student, was attacked near her student accommodation, was killed with the same pattern that had characterized all the previous murders, was another victim who was not a prostitute, who was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, who paid with her life for the investigation's failure to identify Peter Sutcliffe despite having interviewed him, despite having connected him to physical evidence, despite having multiple opportunities to recognize that he was the killer they were seeking. Barbara's murder devastated the university community, created fear among students who had previously felt relatively safe, demonstrated that education and class offered no protection against the Ripper, that he was willing to attack anyone, anywhere, at any time. The year 1979 ended with the investigation in disarray, with public confidence in police competence severely damaged, with women across Yorkshire living in fear that was justified by the continuing murders, with the hoax having successfully diverted attention away from the real killer, who was continuing his campaign unimpeded by the massive investigation that was supposedly pursuing him. The tape continued to be played, the voice continued to be analysed, the tips continued to pour in from people who thought they recognised the accent or who wanted to report suspicious persons, but all of it was wasted effort. All of it was pursuing a phantom while the real Ripper continued killing. George Oldfield, who had become personally invested in the case and who had staked his professional reputation on the authenticity of the tape, suffered a heart attack in late 1979, was hospitalised and eventually recovered, but never returned to full-time leadership of the investigation, was replaced by other senior officers who inherited a case that had been fundamentally compromised by the hoax, that had developed in wrong directions, that had eliminated the actual killer as a suspect based on false criteria, that would require complete reassessment if it was ever to be solved. But the reassessment did not occur quickly enough. The investigation continued to pursue the Sunderland connection well into 1980, continued to waste resources on a lead that was completely false, continued to allow Peter Sutcliffe to kill because he did not match the profile that had been created by someone who was not the Ripper. The hoax represented catastrophic failure of police procedure and judgment, demonstrated how even experienced investigators could be led astray by evidence that seemed compelling, but that should have been subjected to more skeptical analysis, showed how desperation for progress in a stalled investigation could lead to acceptance of information that was convenient rather than information that was necessarily accurate. The failure would be examined extensively in the inquiry that followed Sutcliffe's eventual arrest, would lead to reforms in how police handled communications claiming to be from perpetrators, would become a case study in how investigations could go wrong even when massive resources were being devoted to them, would stand as warning about the dangers of confirmation bias and tunnel vision in criminal investigation. But in 1979 and into 1980, as the investigation pursued the hoaxer and as Peter Sutcliffe continued killing, the full scope of the disaster was not yet apparent. The realization that the investigation had been completely diverted had not yet occurred. The understanding that lives had been lost because police were pursuing the wrong suspect had not yet been confronted. The Yorkshire Ripper continued his reign of terror, while the investigation that should have stopped him remained focused on finding someone who did not exist, someone whose voice and handwriting and profile were all false, someone who was laughing at police from Sunderland, while the real killer drove his truck through Yorkshire and selected his next victim and prepared to kill again. Chapter 5. The Killing Accelerates. The year 1980 marked the acceleration of Peter Sutcliffe's murder campaign, and the intensification of the terror that gripped Yorkshire and beyond marked the period when the investigation's failures became most apparent and most costly. When the Ripper demonstrated that he could kill with impunity despite being questioned repeatedly by police, when 6 more women would die because the investigation remained diverted by the hoax, and because systemic failures prevented the connections from being made that should have identified Sutcliffe long before his eventual arrest. The first murder of 1980 occurred on August 19th when Marguerite Walls was killed in Leeds, was attacked while walking home from work, was a 47-year-old civil servant, was strangled rather than being bludgeoned with a hammer, though she was found with injuries consistent with Ripper. Attacks was initially not attributed to the Ripper because the method varied slightly from previous murders, was only later confirmed as a Ripper victim after Sutcliffe's confession provided details that had not been publicly released. Marguerite's murder demonstrated that Sutcliffe was willing to vary his methods when circumstances required, that he was adaptable and was not bound to rigid patterns, that the investigation's focus on specific characteristics might cause them to miss murders that varied in details while sharing the same essential elements. The murder that would prove to be most significant in generating public pressure for the investigation to be resolved occurred on September the 24th when Jacqueline Hill was killed in Leeds, was a 20-year-old student at Leeds University, was attacked while walking back to her halls of residence after an evening out, was murdered with the hammer and stabbing pattern that had characterized most of the Ripper attacks, was found on waste ground near her accommodation with massive head injuries and stab wounds that left no doubt about the killer's identity. Jacqueline's murder created outrage and panic that exceeded even the response to Jane MacDonald's death 3 years earlier, represented the breaking point where public confidence in the police investigation collapsed completely, where demands for resignation of senior officers and for fundamental reform of the investigation became impossible to ignore. The murder of a university student in circumstances where she should have been safe, where she was simply walking a short distance from familiar surroundings to her residence, where nothing in her behaviour or her choices could be characterised as risky or careless, demonstrated more clearly than any previous murder that the Ripper was a threat to all women regardless of their lifestyle or their circumstances, that education and class and respectability offered no protection, that the failure to catch him was putting every woman in Yorkshire at risk. The universities in Leeds and Bradford became centres of protest and anger, with students demanding action, with women refusing to go out after dark, with a sense that normal life had become impossible while the Ripper remained at large. The press coverage of Jacqueline Hill's murder was intense and was highly critical of the police investigation, with newspapers questioning how the Ripper could have continued killing for 5 years, how he could have murdered 13 women without being caught, how the investigation could have consumed so many resources and interviewed so many suspects without identifying the killer, how Peter Sutcliffe could have been questioned 9 times without being arrested. The coverage revealed details about the hoax and about how it had diverted the investigation, created public understanding that the inquiry had been fundamentally compromised, generated demands for accountability and for reform that would eventually lead to public inquiry after Sutcliffe's arrest. But the media criticism and the public pressure came too late to prevent the murders that had occurred during 1980, came too late to save Margaret Walls or Jacqueline Hill or the other victims whose deaths might have been prevented, if the investigation had not been so completely focused on finding someone with a Sunderland accent, if Peter Sutcliffe had been arrested during one of his 9 interviews, if the connections between his vehicle and multiple murder locations had been recognised and acted upon, if the £5 note evidence had been followed up more thoroughly, if any of the multiple opportunities to identify him had been seized rather than being missed. Peter Sutcliffe during this period continued to live his double life with apparent ease, continued working as a truck driver, continued his marriage to Sonia, despite ongoing tensions and despite her mental health problems, continued to maintain friendships and social connections that gave no indication he was a serial killer, continued to present himself as ordinary working-class man whose quiet demeanour and whose normal lifestyle convinced everyone who knew him that he could not possibly be involved in the horrific murders that were dominating the news. His ability to compartmentalise, to separate his identity as killer from his identity as husband and worker and neighbour, to kill and then to return to ordinary life without displaying guilt or anxiety, or any of the emotional responses that might have aroused suspicion, demonstrated profound psychological abnormality that was completely hidden beneath the surface of normality. The investigation during 1980 was characterised by increasing desperation and by growing recognition that fundamental problems were preventing the case from being solved. The Ripper squad had grown to include more than 300 officers, had generated more than 5 million months, had interviewed more than 300,000 people, had followed up on more than 30,000 tips from the public, had created bureaucratic apparatus that was so massive it was becoming unmanageable, where information was being lost or was not being properly cross-referenced, where different parts of the investigation were not communicating effectively with each other, where the sheer volume of data was overwhelming the systems that had been created to manage it. The technological limitations of 1980 meant that all of this information was being recorded on paper, was being stored in filing systems that were inadequate for the volume, was being analysed manually by officers who had to physically compare reports and statements and interview records to identify connections and patterns. The Holmes computer system that would later revolutionise major crime investigation in Britain did not yet exist, was developed partly in response to the failures of the Ripper investigation, meant that the 1980 inquiry was operating with tools and methods that were not adequate for tracking a serial killer who was operating across multiple jurisdictions and who was being interviewed repeatedly without those interviews being properly coordinated or analysed. Peter Sutcliffe was interviewed for the 9th and final time before his arrest in November 1980, was questioned about his vehicle, which had been seen in red light districts on 5 different occasions, was asked to account for his presence in areas where murders had occurred, provided explanations that were accepted despite being flimsy, was allowed to leave despite the accumulating evidence that should have made him a prime suspect, was eliminated once again because he did not have a Sunderland accent and because the investigation remained focused on finding the hoaxer rather than on evaluating the evidence that pointed towards Sutcliffe. The 9th interview represented the final missed opportunity before Sutcliffe's arrest, the last chance to identify him through competent investigation rather than through the chance encounter that would eventually bring him into custody. Psychological toll on women living in Yorkshire during this period was enormous and was lasting. Created atmosphere of fear that affected daily life in profound ways, changed how women behaved and where they went and how they moved through public space, created restrictions on freedom and independence that represented victory for the killer even while he remained uncaught. Women stopped going out alone after dark, arranged to travel in groups, carried weapons for self-defense despite this being illegal, took taxis rather than walking even short distances, organised themselves to provide mutual protection in ways that demonstrated how completely the Ripper had succeeded in terrorising the female population of Yorkshire. The police response to this fear included increased patrols in areas where attacks had occurred, included warnings to women about being cautious after dark, included advice that was well-intentioned, but that placed responsibility on potential victims rather than on the investigation to catch the killer, that suggested women should modify their behaviour rather than that police should be more competent in identifying the threat. The approach generated criticism from women's groups who argued that the focus should be on catching the Ripper, rather than on restricting women's freedom, who pointed out that the advice to avoid being out alone effectively allowed the killer to control women's lives, who demanded that the investigation be more effective rather than that women be more careful. The year 1980 ended with 6 murders, with the investigation in crisis, with public confidence destroyed, with women living in fear, with Peter Sutcliffe having demonstrated that he could continue killing despite the massive resources being devoted to catching him, despite being interviewed 9 times, despite connections between his vehicle and murder locations being documented, despite evidence that should have identified him if the investigation had not been so completely focused on pursuing the hoaxer, and if the systemic failures in information management had not prevented the connections from being made that would have revealed him as the Ripper. The acceleration of killing during 1980, the 6 murders that occurred in that single year compared to the 13 total murders over the entire 5-year campaign, demonstrated that Sutcliffe's violence was intensifying, that the intervals between murders were shortening, that whatever psychological process drove him to kill was becoming more urgent and more frequent, that he was losing whatever control had allowed him to space the murders more widely during the earlier years of his campaign. The acceleration suggested that if he was not caught soon, the murder rate would continue to increase, that 1981 might see even more victims, that the terror would intensify until either Sutcliffe was arrested or until he made a mistake that would lead to his identification. The investigation remained stalled, remained unable to identify Sutcliffe despite all the evidence, remained focused on wrong theories and wrong suspects, remained hampered by the systemic failures that prevented effective analysis of the massive amount of information that had been collected, remained compromised by the hoax that had diverted attention away from the actual killer. The resolution would come not from competent investigation, but from chance, from a routine police encounter that had nothing to do with the Ripper inquiry, from luck rather than from skill, from circumstances that would finally bring Peter Sutcliffe into custody and would end the reign of terror that had gripped Yorkshire for 5 years and that had cost 13 lives and had devastated countless others who had lived in fear while the killer remained free. Chapter 6. The Survivors Who Saw His Face. The women who survived Peter Sutcliffe's attacks were fewer in number than those who died, but their experiences were no less significant to understanding his crimes and to the investigation that failed to catch him. Their testimony provided descriptions and details that should have helped identify him long before his eventual arrest. Their courage in fighting back or in surviving, despite horrific injuries, represented triumph over violence that deserves recognition, alongside the mourning for those who are not so fortunate. The survivors saw his face, heard his voice, observed details about his vehicle and his appearance and his behaviour, provided information to police that was recorded and was analysed but that was not acted upon effectively, that was not properly cross-referenced with other evidence, that was not given the weight it deserved in an investigation that remained focused on the hoax, and that eliminated Sutcliffe as a suspect despite testimony from women who had encountered him and lived. The first known survivor of a Sutcliffe attack was Anna Rogulski, who was struck with a hammer in Keighley in July 1975, 3 months before Wilma McCann's murder, who survived because Sutcliffe was interrupted by someone approaching, who provided police with description of her attacker and of his vehicle, who gave information that should have been useful, but that was not connected to subsequent attacks, because the investigation was not coordinated, and because the significance of the attack was not recognised at the time. Anna's description matched Sutcliffe's appearance. Her account of the vehicle matched his car, but the information was filed away and was not referenced when later attacks occurred, was not used to develop composite pictures or to narrow the suspect pool, represented the first of many missed opportunities where information from survivors could have identified the Ripper if it had been properly utilised. Olive Smelt was attacked in August 1975 in Halifax, was struck with a hammer, but survived because Sutcliffe fled when he heard voices of people approaching, provided police with description that was similar to Anna's description, described a man of medium height with dark hair, described a vehicle that matched Sutcliffe's car, gave information that should have been combined with Anna's account to develop more detailed profile of the attacker. But the 2 attacks were investigated separately, were not immediately connected as being the work of the same person, were not linked to the Wilma McCann murder that would occur 2 months later, represented failure of coordination and information sharing that would characterise the entire investigation and that would allow Sutcliffe to continue attacking and killing without being identified. Marcella Claxton was attacked in May 1976 in Leeds, was struck with a hammer and was left for dead but survived despite suffering skull fractures and permanent injuries, was able to provide detailed description of her attacker, including facial features and clothing, described a man with a beard and with dark curly hair, described someone who matched Peter Sutcliffe's appearance during that period, gave information to police that was recorded but that was not effectively used to identify suspects or to narrow the investigation focus. Marcella's description was specific and was detailed, should have been invaluable to the investigation, should have been used to create composite images that could be distributed widely, should have been combined with descriptions from other survivors to build a comprehensive picture of the attacker. But the investigation's treatment of survivor testimony was problematic in ways that reflected both the technological limitations of the time and the prejudices about victims that influenced how seriously their accounts were taken. Some survivors had been drinking before they were attacked, which led investigators to question the reliability of their testimony, to wonder whether their memories were accurate, to treat their accounts with skepticism that would not have been applied if they had been sober. Some survivors were prostitutes, which led to similar questions about credibility, to assumptions that their testimony might be less reliable because of their lifestyle, to treatment that reflected class prejudices and moral judgments about which victims deserved to be believed and which deserved less credibility. Maureen Long was attacked in July 1977 in Bradford, was struck with a hammer and was stabbed repeatedly, but survived despite horrific injuries, was able to describe her attacker in detail, was able to describe his vehicle, provided information that matched previous descriptions and that should have helped narrow the suspect pool significantly. Maureen described a man with dark beard and with curly hair, described someone who was about 5 feet 8 inches tall, described mannerisms and speech patterns that she had observed during the brief interaction before the attack, gave police more information than any previous survivor had been able to provide because she had spent more time with Sutcliffe before he attacked her. But Maureen's testimony was complicated by the fact that she had difficulty identifying Sutcliffe definitively when shown photographs during the investigation, was uncertain about whether photographs she was shown actually depicted the man who had attacked her, experienced the normal difficulties of memory and recognition that affect eyewitness testimony, especially after trauma. The investigation used her uncertainty as reason to discount her testimony partly, to question whether she could be relied upon to provide accurate identification, to treat her account as less valuable than it should have been treated, given that she was one of few people who had spent significant time with Sutcliffe before an attack and who had observed him closely enough to provide detailed description. Teresa Sykes was attacked in November 1977 in Huddersfield, was struck with a hammer, but survived when Sutcliffe was interrupted, provided description that matched previous accounts, described beard and dark hair and medium height, described vehicle that was consistent with Sutcliffe's car, added her testimony to the growing body of survivor accounts that should have been creating a clear picture of the attacker, but that was not being synthesized effectively because the investigation lacked the systems and the procedures needed to combine information from multiple sources into coherent profile. The pattern in the survivor testimony was clear and was consistent, described a man who matched Peter Sutcliffe's appearance during the period when the attacks were occurring, described vehicle characteristics that matched his car, provided details about behavior and about method of attack that were consistent across multiple accounts, created foundation for identification that should have made Sutcliffe a prime suspect long before his eventual arrest. But the investigation failed to synthesize this information effectively, failed to combine the survivor accounts with other evidence like the £5 note and the vehicle sightings and the 9 interviews, failed to recognize that all of this evidence pointed toward the same person, failed to overcome the diversion created by the hoax that made investigators discount suspects who did not have Sunderland accents, regardless of how well they matched the descriptions provided by survivors. The survivors themselves faced additional trauma beyond the physical injuries they had sustained, faced the knowledge that they had been attacked by someone who had killed others and who might kill again, faced guilt about having survived when others had died, faced the frustration of seeing the investigation fail to catch the attacker despite the information they had provided, faced the fear that he might return to attack them again, to eliminate them as witnesses. Some survivors moved away from Yorkshire, relocated to other parts of the country where they felt safer, where they could try to rebuild their lives away from the place where they had been attacked and where the Ripper was still operating. The psychological impact on survivors was profound and was lasting, included post-traumatic stress and anxiety and depression, included nightmares and flashbacks and hypervigilance, included all the typical responses to violent trauma that would today be recognised and treated, but that in the late 1970s and early 1980s were less well understood and less effectively addressed. The survivors received some support from victim services and from mental health professionals, but the resources available were limited, and the understanding of trauma was incomplete, meant that many survivors struggled alone with the psychological aftermath of their attacks, tried to cope with memories and fears that would never entirely disappear even after Sutcliffe was arrested and imprisoned. When Sutcliffe was finally arrested in January 1981, the survivors were asked to identify him, to confirm that he was indeed the man who had attacked them, to provide testimony that would support the prosecution's case. Most survivors were able to identify him definitively once they saw him, recognized his face and his appearance despite the years that had passed since their attacks, provided positive identifications that confirmed their earlier descriptions had been accurate, demonstrated that if the investigation had properly utilized their testimony, he could have been identified much earlier, that their courage in providing detailed accounts to police should have led to his arrest long before 13 women were dead. The survivors' testimony at trial was powerful and was moving, described attacks that were terrifying and brutal, described Sutcliffe's coldness and his methodical violence, described how close they had come to death and how fortunate they had been to survive, provided human dimension to crimes that might otherwise have been reduced to statistics and forensic evidence, reminded everyone involved that these were real attacks on real women whose lives had been forever changed by their encounters with the Yorkshire Ripper. The survivors' courage in testifying, in facing Sutcliffe in court, in reliving their trauma for the purpose of ensuring his conviction, deserved recognition and deserved respect that was not always provided in a trial that focused primarily on the murder victims, and that sometimes treated the survivors as secondary witnesses rather than as victims in their own right. The women who survived Peter Sutcliffe's attacks carried physical scars and psychological wounds that would last for the rest of their lives, carried the knowledge that they had looked into the face of evil and had lived to tell about it, carried the frustration of knowing that their testimony should have been used more effectively, should have led to arrests that would have prevented subsequent murders, should have been valued more highly by an investigation that remained focused on wrong theories and wrong suspects. Their survival was testament to human resilience, to the will to live even when facing overwhelming violence, to the courage required to provide testimony that might help catch a killer, even when that testimony meant reliving trauma and facing uncertainty about whether it would be believed or whether it would be acted upon. Chapter 7. 9 Times Questioned. The most damning indictment of the Yorkshire Ripper investigation was not that Peter Sutcliffe remained unidentified for 5 years despite massive effort, was not simply that the hoax diverted resources and attention, was not even that information was poorly managed and was not properly synthesized, but rather that Peter Sutcliffe was interviewed by police 9 separate times between 1977 and 1980, was questioned about his movements and about his vehicle, and about his presence in areas where murders had occurred, was evaluated as a potential suspect on multiple occasions, and was allowed to walk away each time without being arrested, without being subjected to the kind of intensive investigation that would have revealed him as the killer, without the connections being made that should have been obvious if the different interviews had been properly coordinated and analysed. The first interview occurred in 1977, when Peter was stopped as part of routine questioning of men who were using red light districts in Leeds and Bradford, was asked about his reasons for being in those areas, provided explanations about looking for prostitutes or about driving through on his way to other destinations, was noted in police records as someone who frequented areas where the Ripper was known to operate but was not subjected to follow-up investigation because thousands of men used those areas and because simply being present in a red light district was not evidence of involvement in murder. The interview was brief and was routine, was one of thousands of similar encounters that police conducted as part of their effort to identify the Ripper through systematic questioning of men who might be potential suspects. The second interview occurred in October 1977 when Peter's vehicle was identified as having been in the vicinity of Jean Jourdain's murder in Manchester, was connected through the £5 note that Jean had been paid shortly before her death, was traced through the bank that had issued the note to the haulage firm that employed Peter and that had paid wages partially in new £5 notes. Peter was interviewed at his workplace, was asked whether he had been in Manchester on the relevant date, whether he had paid anyone with a £5 note, whether he could account for his movements, provided explanations that were plausible or, at least not immediately disprovable, explained that he drove regularly in Manchester as part of his work, that he might have given money to someone but could not remember specifically, that his presence in the area was related to legitimate business rather than to anything suspicious. The interview was more detailed than the first had been, was conducted by detectives who understood the significance of the £5 note connection, who were treating Peter as a serious suspect rather than as simply one of many men to be questioned routinely. But the interview did not result in arrest because Peter's explanations were accepted, because he presented himself as ordinary truck driver who was cooperating fully with police inquiry, because he did not display nervousness or guilt or any of the behavioural indicators that might have raised additional suspicion, because he was skilled at maintaining his mask of normality, even when being questioned about murder. The interview was documented and Peter's name was entered into the investigation's records as someone who had been questioned and eliminated, but the elimination was premature and was based on insufficient investigation, represented another missed opportunity to identify the Ripper before he killed again. The third through fifth interviews occurred during 1978 and 1979 as Peter's vehicle continued to be seen in red light districts, continued to be noted by officers conducting surveillance, continued to generate reports that were filed and that were recorded but that were not properly cross-referenced with the earlier interviews, were not recognised as indicating pattern of behaviour that should have elevated Peter to the status of prime suspect. Each interview followed similar pattern, with Peter being questioned about why his vehicle had been seen in specific locations, with Peter providing explanations about driving for work or about looking for prostitutes or about other innocent reasons for being in areas where the Ripper was known to operate, with the interviewing officers accepting his explanations and allowing him to leave without further investigation. The failure to recognise that Peter was being interviewed repeatedly, that his vehicle was being connected to multiple suspicious circumstances, that the accumulating evidence suggested he should be investigated more thoroughly, rather than being routinely eliminated, represented systemic failure in how the investigation managed information. The different interviews were conducted by different officers, were recorded in different parts of the massive filing system that the investigation had created, were not properly cross-referenced or analysed to identify suspects who were appearing multiple times in the records, were not subjected to the kind of synthesis that would have revealed Peter as someone who deserved intensive investigation rather than routine elimination. The sixth interview occurred in July 1979 and was more detailed than the previous interviews had been, was conducted after Peter's vehicle had been seen in red light districts on 5 separate occasions, was treated as opportunity to evaluate him more carefully as potential suspect, included questions about his handwriting and about his voice to determine whether he matched the hoaxer's profile. Peter was asked to provide handwriting samples, was asked to speak so officers could evaluate his accent, was assessed against the criteria that had been developed based on the hoax letters and tape, was eliminated because his handwriting did not match the letters and because he did not have a Sunderland accent, because he did not fit the profile that the investigation had decided the Ripper must match. The elimination based on the hoax criteria was a catastrophic mistake that would allow Peter to continue killing for another 18 months, that would cost at least 6 more lives, that represented the most direct and most devastating consequence of the investigation's focus on wrong suspect. Peter matched the descriptions provided by survivors. His vehicle had been connected to multiple murder locations. He had been interviewed repeatedly about his presence in red light districts. The accumulating evidence pointed strongly toward him being the Ripper. But all of this was discounted because he did not sound like the tape and did not write like the letters, because the investigation had become so focused on the hoax that contradictory evidence was ignored or was not given proper weight. The 7th and 8th interviews occurred during 1980 and followed the same pattern as earlier interviews, questioned Peter about his vehicle being seen in suspicious locations, accepted his explanations, allowed him to leave without arrest or intensive follow-up investigation, added his name to the records for another time without recognising that he was appearing repeatedly, without the connections being made that should have elevated him to prime suspect status. The repetition of interviews without recognition of the pattern represented failure of both technology and procedure, demonstrated that the paper-based filing system was inadequate for managing the volume of information the investigation was generating, showed that procedures for tracking suspects across multiple encounters were insufficient or were not being followed properly. The 9th and final interview before Peter's arrest occurred in November 1980, was conducted by officers who had reviewed his file and who had noted that his vehicle had been seen in suspicious circumstances on 5 occasions, who were treating him as someone who deserved more careful scrutiny than he had received in previous interviews, who spent more time questioning him about his movements and about his reasons for being in red light districts. Peter was interviewed for several hours, was pressed more firmly about inconsistencies in his accounts, was asked more detailed questions about specific dates and specific locations, but ultimately was allowed to leave because the interview did not produce evidence sufficient to justify arrest, because his explanations were plausible enough that the interviewing officers did not feel they had grounds to detain him. The 9th interview represented the last opportunity to identify Peter through competent investigation before his eventual arrest through chance encounter, represented the final failure in a series of failures that had allowed him to continue killing despite being questioned repeatedly, despite accumulating evidence that should have identified him as the Ripper. The interview was documented and was added to Peter's file, which by this point included records of all 9 interviews, included documentation of vehicle sightings in suspicious locations, included the £5 note connection, included information that if properly synthesized would have provided overwhelming circumstantial case that Peter was the Ripper, and that should have led to his arrest and to intensive investigation that would have confirmed his guilt. But the synthesis did not occur. The connections were not made. The pattern was not recognized despite being obvious in retrospect, and Peter walked away from the 9th interview free to kill again, free to continue his reign of terror that would claim one more victim before his eventual arrest, free because the investigation remained focused on finding someone with a Sunderland accent, and because the systemic failures in information management prevented the evidence from being properly analysed. The 9th interview would be examined extensively in the public inquiry that followed Peter's arrest, would be cited as example of how the investigation had failed despite enormous effort, and despite having the information needed to identify the killer, would become symbol of the systemic problems that had allowed Peter to operate for 5 years despite being within reach of investigators who questioned him repeatedly, but who failed to recognise what they had. The officers who conducted the 9 interviews were not individually incompetent or negligent, were in most cases following procedures, and were conducting their interviews professionally, were doing what was expected of them within the systems and the frameworks that the investigation had established. The failure was systemic rather than individual, was a result of inadequate procedures for tracking suspects across multiple encounters, was consequence of poor information management that prevented cross-referencing and pattern recognition, was outcome of the hoax's diversion that caused investigators to eliminate suspects who did not match the wrong profile, was product of the massive scale of the investigation that had generated so much information that it became unmanageable with the technology and the procedures available in 1980, but systemic. Failure did not lessen the tragedy of the missed opportunities, did not reduce the cost in lives that might have been saved if Peter had been arrested during one of the 9 interviews, did not diminish the responsibility that the investigation bore for failing to identify him, despite having him within reach repeatedly. The 9 interviews stood as testament to how serial killers could hide in plain sight, could maintain masks of normality, even when being questioned about murders, could talk their way through police encounters without arousing sufficient suspicion to lead to arrest, could exploit the limitations and the failures of investigations that were large and well-intentioned, but that were not competent enough or fortunate enough to identify them before they killed again and again. Peter Sutcliffe, after each interview, returned to his life in Bradford, returned to his work driving trucks, returned to his marriage to Sonia, returned to whatever he did in the hours when he was not working or sleeping, carried within him the knowledge that he had killed and would kill again, carried the satisfaction that he was smarter than police or luckier than they were competent, carried whatever it was that drove him to murder women with hammers and knives and screwdrivers, continued living his double existence as ordinary man and as serial killer, without the 2 identities colliding in ways that would expose him to the police who had questioned him 9 times and who had failed 9 times to recognise what he was. Chapter 8. The Final Victims and the Arrest. The murder that would prove to be Peter Sutcliffe's penultimate victim occurred on November 17th, 1980, when Jacqueline Hill was killed in Leeds, was attacked while walking back to her halls of residence after spending the evening studying in a friend's room, was murdered in circumstances that demonstrated that even the most cautious behaviour offered no protection against the Ripper, that simply being a woman walking alone after dark in Yorkshire was sufficient risk to make death possible, that the investigation's failure to identify Sutcliffe had created the situation where terror was justified, and where normal student life had become impossible for women who understood that they were potential victims of a killer who remained at large despite 5 years of investigation. Jacqueline was found the following morning on waste ground near her residence, found with the characteristic injuries that marked all Ripper murders, massive head trauma from hammer blows and stab wounds to the chest and abdomen, found with her possessions scattered around her, found in circumstances that left no doubt about the killer's identity, that created immediate recognition that the Ripper had struck again, that generated despair among investigators who had failed once more to prevent a murder, despite the enormous resources being devoted to the case. Jacqueline's murder created unprecedented public outcry, generated demands for the investigation leadership to resign, created political crisis that made it clear that the status quo was unsustainable, that fundamental changes were needed if the Ripper was ever to be caught. The investigation after Jacqueline Hill's murder was characterized by desperation and by recognition that the case could not continue as it had been, that new approaches were needed, that the focus on the hoax needed to be abandoned, that the entire inquiry needed to be reassessed and restructured. Senior officers began reviewing the massive files that had accumulated, began attempting to identify suspects who'd been interviewed multiple times, began trying to determine whether the investigation had missed obvious connections, began the process that would eventually reveal Peter Sutcliffe had been questioned 9 times, but that revelation would come too late to prevent the murder that had just occurred, and too late to prevent the next murder that would be Sutcliffe's last. But before the review could produce results, before the investigation could be restructured, before the new approaches could be implemented, Peter Sutcliffe was arrested through circumstances that had nothing to do with the Ripper inquiry, was taken into custody not because the investigation finally identified him, but because he was stopped during routine police patrol. In circumstances that were completely unrelated to the murders he had committed, was arrested by officers who had no idea they had just caught the Yorkshire Ripper, who were simply conducting normal police work that happened to intersect with Sutcliffe's activities in ways that would finally end his reign of terror. On January 2nd, 1981, 2 police officers conducting routine patrol in Sheffield, approximately 30 miles south of Leeds, noticed a vehicle with false number plates parked in an area known for prostitution. The officers approached the vehicle and found Peter Sutcliffe sitting in the driver's seat with a prostitute named Olivia Rivers in the passenger seat, found them in circumstances that suggested they were about to engage in transaction for sex, decided to question them about the false plates and about what they were doing in the area. Peter explained that the plates were false because he did not want his wife to know he was using prostitutes, explained that he and Olivia had been negotiating terms, provided explanations that were plausible, but that did not satisfy the officers who decided to arrest him for the false plates and to bring him to the police station for further questioning. Peter asked if he could urinate before being taken to the station, was allowed to go behind a storage tank in the area where they had been parked, used the opportunities to dispose of weapons he was carrying, dropped a hammer and a knife into the shadows behind the tank where he hoped they would not be found, returned to the officers who took him to Dewsbury Police Station where he was booked for the false plates offence and where he was placed in a cell while officers processed the arrest. The prostitute Olivia was questioned separately and was released, was not charged with any offence, provided information about Peter that was routine and that did not immediately raise suspicions about anything beyond the false plates. But the arresting officer, Sergeant Robert Ring, felt something was wrong about Peter, noticed details about his appearance and about his vehicle that seemed significant, recalled that the Ripper investigation had circulated descriptions of suspects and of vehicles that might be connected to the murders, decided to contact the Ripper squad to inform them that he had arrested someone who might be of interest to their investigation. The contact was made, information about Peter was provided, including his name and his address in Bradford, and the circumstances of his arrest. The information was checked against the Ripper squad's records. The check revealed that Peter Sutcliffe had been interviewed 9 times previously, that his vehicle had been connected to multiple suspicious circumstances, that he was someone the investigation should have been focused on intensively but had not. The revelation that the man arrested for false plates was someone who had been questioned 9 times in connection with the Ripper murders generated immediate recognition that this might be significant arrest, that Peter should be questioned not just about false plates but about the murders, that intensive investigation was warranted to determine whether the man in custody might be the killer who had been sought for 5 years. Officers from the Ripper squad arrived at Dewsbury Police Station, began questioning Peter about his movements and about his connections to locations where murders had occurred, began the interview that would eventually lead to his confession. But before the confession came, before Peter admitted to anything, the physical evidence was discovered that would prove his guilt regardless of whether he confessed. The officer who had arrested Peter remembered that he had been allowed to urinate behind the storage tank, wondered whether Peter might have used that opportunity to dispose of something, returned us to the location with another officer to search the area, found the hammer and the knife that Peter had dropped, found weapons that matched descriptions from autopsy reports of injuries inflicted on Ripper victim, found evidence that connected Peter directly to the murders, and that would support prosecution even if he refused to confess. The questioning of Peter Sutcliffe continued over the following days as investigators worked to build the case against him, worked to connect him to specific murders through evidence and through his own statements, worked to understand the scope of his crimes and whether he had killed more women than the 13 that were known. Peter initially denied involvement in the some murders, maintained that he had been arrested only for false plates, claimed that any connection to the Ripper case was coincidence, attempted to sustain the pretense that he was an ordinary truck driver who had been caught with a prostitute but who was not involved in anything more serious. But the evidence was overwhelming, and Peter eventually recognized that denial was futile, that the weapons and the 9 previous interviews and the vehicle connections and the accumulating circumstantial case would be sufficient to convict him regardless of whether he confessed, decided that confession might serve his interests better than continued denial, began to provide information about the murders he had committed. The confession emerged gradually over multiple interview sessions, began with admission to 1 or 2 murders, and expanded eventually to encompass all 13 victims whose deaths would be charged against him. Included details about methods and about locations and about timing that could be verified against investigation records, provided information that only the killer could have known. Peter's confession was detailed and was methodical, described each murder with calm precision that disturbed the investigators who were conducting the interviews, demonstrated no remorse or regret about what he had done, presented the murders as though they were simply tasks that had been accomplished, rather than as crimes that had destroyed lives and devastated families. He described hearing voices that commanded him to kill prostitutes, claimed that God had given him a mission to cleanse the streets, provided religious justification for his murders that would later become central to his defense strategy, but that investigators recognized as likely fabrication designed to support insanity defense, rather than as genuine religious delusion. The arrest of Peter Sutcliffe on January 2, 1981, ended the 5-year reign of the Yorkshire Ripper, ended the terror that had gripped Yorkshire and beyond, ended the investigation that had consumed enormous resources and that had failed repeatedly to identify the killer despite having him within reach. But the arrest also raised profound questions about how Peter had been able to operate for so long despite being questioned 9 times, about why the investigation had not identified him earlier, about what systemic failures had allowed him to continue killing despite accumulating evidence that should have made him the prime suspect, about whether the murders that occurred after his first interview could have been prevented if the investigation had been more competent or more fortunate. The relief that Peter had finally been caught was tempered by the recognition that the arrest had occurred through chance rather than through investigative competence, that 2 routine patrol officers conducting unrelated police work had accomplished what thousands of investigators working on the Ripper case for 5 years had failed to accomplish, that the massive investigation had not solved the case but had instead been bypassed by fortune that had placed Peter in the wrong place at the wrong time with false plates that gave officers reason to arrest him. The arrest was victory but was also indictment, demonstrated that serial killers could be caught, but also demonstrated how easily they could escape detection, how many opportunities could be missed, how much suffering could occur while investigations failed to identify threats that were hiding in plain sight. Peter Sutcliffe was charged with 13 counts of murder and with 7 counts of attempted murder, was remanded in custody to await trial that would occur later in 1981, was held in prison where he could no longer threaten women, where his reign of terror was definitively ended, where he would remain for the rest of his life regardless of the trial's outcome, because the evidence of his guilt was overwhelming, and because no jury would believe his claims of divine mission or would accept that his murders were anything other than crimes that deserved the harshest punishment available under British law. Chapter 9. The Trial and the Diagnosis. The trial of Peter William Sutcliffe, for the murders of 13 women and the attempted murders of 7 others, began at the Old Bailey in London on April 29, 1981, 3 months after his arrest, in proceedings that would last 2 weeks and that would attract unprecedented media attention, that would raise profound questions about criminal responsibility and mental illness, that would force examination of whether someone who heard voices commanding him to kill could be held fully accountable for murders committed under influence of those voices, whether paranoid schizophrenia diminished responsibility in ways that should affect verdict and sentencing. The prosecution was led by Sir Michael Hevers, the Attorney General, who presented the case methodically and comprehensively, introduced evidence connecting Peter to each of the 13 murders and to the 7 attempted murders, presented the weapons that had been recovered from behind the storage tank in Sheffield, presented testimony from survivors who identified Peter as their attacker, presented forensic evidence linking Peter to crime scenes, presented his own confession with its detailed descriptions of how each murder had been committed, built overwhelming case that Peter had killed 13 women and had attempted to kill 7 others, and that he had done so deliberately and with planning and with full awareness of what he was doing. The defense strategy was to accept that Peter had committed the murders, but to argue that he was suffering from paranoid schizophrenia at the time, that he genuinely heard voices commanding him to kill prostitutes, that he believed he was on divine mission to cleanse the streets of immoral women, that his mental illness diminished his responsibility for the murders in ways that should result in verdict of manslaughter rather than murder, that should lead to him being sent to secure psychiatric hospital rather than to prison, that should recognize that he was mentally ill killer rather than being simply evil killer who deserved punishment rather than treatment. The psychiatric evidence presented by the defense was extensive and was provided by multiple experts who had examined Peter and who had concluded that he was suffering from paranoid schizophrenia, that his reports of hearing voices were consistent with that diagnosis, that his belief in divine mission was delusional symptom rather than being rational justification, that his mental illness had substantially impaired his ability to form rational judgments about his actions and about their moral and legal implications. The defense psychiatrists testified that Peter genuinely believed he was doing God's work, that the voices he heard were real to him even if they had no external source, that his mental illness made him less culpable for murders committed under influence of delusions that he could not control or resist. But the prosecution challenged this psychiatric evidence aggressively, presented its own psychiatric experts who had also examined Peter and who had reached different conclusions, who argued that Peter was malingering or exaggerating his symptoms to support his defense strategy, that his reports of hearing voices were fabricated or were retrospective rationalizations for murders that had actually been committed for other reasons, that the planning and the careful execution of the murders demonstrated rational thought and deliberate choice rather than being products of uncontrollable delusions, that Peter was manipulating the psychiatric evaluation process to avoid full criminal responsibility for his actions. The prosecution psychiatrists testified that paranoid schizophrenia typically did not present in the way Peter claimed, that genuine command hallucinations were rare, and that when they occurred they typically involved confused and disorganized behavior rather than the methodical planning that had characterized Peter's murders, that his ability to maintain normal life while committing murders suggested compartmentalization rather than delusion, that his confession had included details about concealing evidence and avoiding detection that demonstrated awareness of wrongdoing and concern about legal consequences, rather than demonstrating belief that his actions were divinely sanctioned and therefore acceptable. The testimony of Sonia Sutcliffe, Peter's wife, was highly anticipated and proved to be significant in ways that both supported and undermined his defense. Sonia testified that Peter had never mentioned hearing voices during their marriage, had never described any religious mission or any divine commands, had never displayed symptoms of mental illness that would have caused her concern or would have led her to seek help for him, had seemed entirely normal in their domestic life together, despite the fact that he was simultaneously conducting a campaign of serial murder. Sonia's testimony suggested either that Peter had been extraordinarily skilled at concealing his mental illness from his wife, or that the mental illness was less severe than his defense claimed, or that the voices and the divine mission were fabrications created after his arrest to support his legal strategy. The jury heard all of this evidence over the course of 2 weeks, heard the prosecution's case for Peter's guilt and the defense's argument for diminished responsibility, heard psychiatric experts disagree about diagnosis and about whether Peter's claimed symptoms were genuine or were feigned, heard survivors describe their attacks and heard evidence about the 13 women who had died, heard Peter's own confession with its calm descriptions of brutal murders, was asked to determine not whether Peter had committed the murders because that was not disputed, but whether he was guilty of murder or whether he was guilty only of manslaughter because of diminished responsibility from mental illness. The judge, Mr. Justice Boreham, instructed the jury carefully about the law regarding diminished responsibility, explained that the defence had to prove on balance of probabilities that Peter was suffering from abnormality of mind that substantially impaired his mental responsibility for his actions, explained that if the jury accepted the defence's psychiatric evidence, they should return verdicts of manslaughter rather than murder, but that if they rejected that evidence, or if they concluded that Peter retained substantial responsibility despite any mental illness, they should return the verdict of murder. The instruction gave the jury a framework for evaluating the conflicting psychiatric evidence and for making the difficult determination about whether someone who heard voices commanding him to kill should be held fully responsible for obeying those commands. The jury deliberated for nearly 6 hours before returning its verdicts on May 22, 1981, found Peter guilty of murder on all 13 counts, rejected the defence's argument for diminished responsibility, accepted the prosecution's position that Peter had been in control of his actions and had chosen to commit murder despite whatever mental health issues he might have had, determined that he should be held fully accountable for his crimes and should be sentenced as a murderer rather than as a mentally ill person who had committed manslaughter while under influence of delusions he could not control. The verdict represented jury's conclusion that Peter had been malingering or exaggerating symptoms, that his claims of divine mission were fabrications designed to avoid responsibility, that the evidence of planning and concealment and rational behaviour demonstrated that he had sufficient mental capacity to be guilty of murder, that whatever voices he might have heard did not substantially impair his ability to understand what he was doing or to choose not to do it. The verdict also represented jury's moral judgment that Peter deserved to be labelled as murderer rather than as mentally ill patient, that the nature and the number of his crimes warranted full criminal responsibility regardless of psychiatric diagnoses, that justice required treating him as criminal who had chosen evil rather than as patient who had been driven by illness. Mr. Justice Boreham sentenced Peter to life imprisonment on each of the 13 murder counts, recommended that he serve minimum of 30 years before being eligible for parole, ensured that Peter would spend most or all of his remaining life in prison, that he would never again be free to threaten women, that he would pay for his crimes through decades of imprisonment that would only end with his death. The sentence reflected the severity of Peter's crimes and the number of victims and the impact on families and on communities that had lived in terror for 5 years while he operated, reflected judicial determination that Peter's crimes warranted the harshest punishment available under British law, which did not include death penalty that had been abolished in 1969. But the trial's conclusion did not end debate about Peter's mental state, or about whether his conviction for murder, rather than manslaughter, was appropriate, did not resolve questions about whether paranoid schizophrenia could coexist with the kind of planning and execution that his murders had involved, did not settle the broader questions about criminal responsibility and mental illness that his case had raised. Peter was transferred to prison where he would serve his sentence, but within months, questions arose about whether he should be transferred to secure psychiatric hospital, whether prison was appropriate setting for someone who might genuinely be mentally ill regardless of jury's verdict, whether treatment should be provided alongside or instead of punishment. In 1984, 3 years after his conviction, Peter was transferred from prison to Broadmoor Hospital, a secure psychiatric facility, after psychiatrists concluded that he was indeed suffering from paranoid schizophrenia and that he required treatment that could not be provided in prison setting. The transfer was controversial, generated criticism from those who believed Peter was manipulating the system to escape harsh prison conditions, generated debate about whether secure hospitals should house convicted murderers, or whether such facilities should be reserved for people who had been found not guilty by reason of insanity. But the transfer stood. Peter spent the next several decades at Broadmoor receiving treatment for mental illness while serving his life sentence, demonstrated that questions about his mental state had not been definitively resolved by jury, verdict that had found him guilty of murder. Peter Sutcliffe remained at Broadmoor until 2016 when he was transferred back to prison after assessment determined that his mental illness was under control and that he no longer required hospital setting, that prison was an appropriate place for him to serve the remainder of his sentence. He died in prison in November 2020 at age 74 from COVID-19 complications, died without ever being released, without ever showing genuine remorse for his crimes, without providing the kind of insight into his motivations that might have helped understand what had driven him to kill 13 women and to terrorize an entire region for 5 years. The trial had determined his guilt and had imposed sentence that ensured he would never be free, but the trial had not resolved the deeper questions about who Peter Sutcliffe was and why he had killed, about whether mental illness explained his crimes or merely complicated them, about whether he was monster or patient or something more complex that resisted simple categorization, about whether justice had been served by his conviction and imprisonment, or whether something more was needed to account for the suffering he had caused and the lives he had destroyed. Chapter 10. The Legacy of Terror. The impact of Peter Sutcliffe's crimes extended far beyond the 13 women he murdered, and the 7 he attacked and left for dead, extended to their families who lost daughters and sisters and mothers, to the communities that had lived in terror for 5 years, to women across Britain who understood that they were potential victims of violence simply because they were women, to the police services that had failed to catch him despite enormous effort, and despite having him within reach repeatedly, to the systems and procedures of criminal investigation that were revealed as inadequate for tracking serial killers who operated across jurisdictions and who maintained masks of normality that allowed them to escape detection. The families of the victims suffered losses that could never be repaired, carried grief that would never end, struggled with anger at the killer who had destroyed their loved ones, and with frustration at the investigation that had failed to prevent the murders, despite having opportunities to identify Sutcliffe before he killed. Some families became advocates for victims' rights, worked to ensure that future victims would be treated better than their loved ones had been treated, pushed for reforms that would give families more information about investigations and more voice in how cases were handled. Others withdrew from public attention, tried to grieve privately, tried to rebuild lives that had been shattered by murders that should never have occurred. The public inquiry into the Yorkshire Ripper investigation was conducted by Lawrence Byford, Her Majesty's Chief Inspector of Constabulary, who was tasked with examining how the investigation had been conducted and why it had failed to identify Sutcliffe despite having him within reach, with determining what systemic failures had occurred and what reforms were needed to prevent similar failures in future investigations. The Byford report, completed in 1982, was devastating in its criticism of the investigation, identified multiple catastrophic failures, including the focus on the hoax that had diverted resources and had caused Sutcliffe to be eliminated as suspect, the poor information management that had prevented recognition that Sutcliffe had been interviewed 9 times, the failure to properly evaluate and synthesize evidence from survivors, the inadequate coordination between different police forces, the absence of effective systems for tracking suspects across multiple encounters. The report recommended fundamental reforms to how major crime investigations were conducted, recommended development of computer systems that would allow better management of information and better identification of patterns, recommended standardized procedures for tracking suspects across multiple jurisdictions, recommended improved training for officers conducting major investigations, recommended creation of national standards for how serial murder cases should be handled. Many of these recommendations were implemented, led directly to development of the Holmes computer system that revolutionized major crime investigation in Britain, led to reforms that made it far less likely that failures like those in the Ripper investigation could occur again, led to improvements that benefited all future investigations even though they came too late to prevent Sutcliffe's murders. The media coverage of the case and of the trial raised important questions about how violence against women was discussed and understood, about whether prostitutes deserved the same concern as other victims, about whether the focus on respectable victims like Jane MacDonald and Jacqueline Hill implicitly devalued the lives of sex workers like Wilma McCann and Emily Jackson, about whether class prejudices influenced how much effort was devoted to solving crimes and how much sympathy was extended to victims and their families. The coverage generated debate about prostitution and about whether women who engaged in sex work were somehow responsible for violence committed against them, about whether danger was inherent in sex work or whether danger came from societal attitudes that stigmatized sex workers and that made them vulnerable to violence because they were not afforded the same protection as other citizens. The feminist movement used the Yorkshire Ripper case to highlight violence against women more broadly, to argue that Sutcliffe's crimes were extreme examples of misogyny that existed throughout society, that all women lived with threat of male violence even if most would never face killer like Sutcliffe, that the response to the murders had revealed how little women's lives were valued by systems that failed to protect them. The Reclaim the Night marches that had begun during the period when Sutcliffe was still operating continued after his arrest, became permanent features of feminist activism, demanded that women should be able to move through public space without fear, that responsibility for preventing violence should rest with potential perpetrators and with society, rather than with potential victims who are told to modify their behavior. The psychological impact on women who had lived through the period of Sutcliffe's operation was profound and was lasting. Created generation of women who grew up with fear of male violence as constant background presence, who learned to be vigilant in ways that men never had to be vigilant, who modified behavior to reduce risk in ways that limited freedom and that represented victory for the terror that Sutcliffe had created. The impact extended beyond Yorkshire, affected women across Britain who understood that serial killers could operate anywhere, that police might not be able to protect them, that being woman meant accepting vulnerability that was not chosen and that was not fair but that was real and that required constant awareness and constant precaution. The legacy of her police services was mixed, included improvements in investigation procedures and in technology that made future investigations more effective, but also included lasting damage to public trust that would take years to rebuild, included recognition that the failure to catch Sutcliffe had been partly institutional and partly cultural, had been product of inadequate systems but also of attitudes about victims and about women that had influenced how seriously different murders were taken and how much effort was devoted to solving them. The reforms that followed the Byford report addressed the systemic failures but could not entirely address the cultural issues, could not force changes in attitudes that were deeply rooted and that would require longer-term social change, rather than simply improve procedures. Peter Sutcliffe's crimes also raised questions about whether they could have been prevented, about whether earlier intervention in his life might have stopped him before he killed, about whether warning signs had been missed by family or by mental health services or by others who knew him. But the reality was that Sutcliffe had displayed few obvious warning signs before he began killing, had been shy and socially awkward, but had not been violent in ways that would have predicted serial murder, had maintained employment and marriage and superficial normality that had concealed whatever psychological processes were developing that would eventually lead to murder. The case demonstrated that serial killers could emerge from apparently ordinary backgrounds, could develop without displaying clear warning signs, could begin killing without obvious, precipitating events, could be anyone and could be hiding anywhere. The question of how many victims Sutcliffe actually killed remained subject to speculation and debate, with some investigators and researchers believing that the 13 confirmed murders and 7 confirmed attacks did not represent the full scope of his crimes, that additional unsolved murders in Yorkshire and elsewhere might have been his work, that he might have begun killing earlier than the 1975 attack on Anna Rogulskis that was his first known offence. But Sutcliffe confessed only to the crimes he was charged with, never admitted to additional murders, took to his grave whatever knowledge he might have had about other victims, left unanswered the questions about whether other families were mourning victims of the Yorkshire Ripper, without knowing that their loved ones had been killed by Britain's most notorious serial killer. The place names associated with Sutcliffe's crimes became infamous, became locations that would forever be associated with his murders, that would carry the weight of history in ways that affected how they were perceived and how people felt about them. Chapeltown and Roundhay Park and Prince Philip playing fields and the other locations where women had died became sites of memorial and of pilgrimage, places where people came to remember victims and to reflect on violence and on loss, places that communities struggled to reclaim from association with murder and terror. The Bedside Historian closes this account of the Yorkshire Ripper with recognition that some evil is inexplicable, that some crimes resist explanation that would make them comprehensible, that Peter Sutcliffe took to his grave the full truth about what drove him to kill 13 women and to terrorise an entire region for 5 years. The investigation failed despite enormous effort, failed because of systemic weaknesses and because of bad luck, and because Sutcliffe was skilled at maintaining his mask of normality, failed in ways that cost lives that might have been saved if the failures had not occurred. But the investigation also eventually succeeded through chance and through determination, eventually brought Sutcliffe to justice even if that justice came too late for many victims, eventually ended the terror even if it could not undo the damage that had been done or restore the lives that had been lost. May the 13 women who died and the 7 who survived rest easier, knowing that their killer was caught and punished, that he spent his remaining years imprisoned, that he never again was free to threaten anyone. Until we meet again in the darkness where history preserves its tragedies, where the past speaks to warn the present, where the stories of victims and of failed investigations and of eventual justice serve as lessons about vigilance and about the price of failure and about the importance of protecting the vulnerable from predators who hide among us. The candle burns. Lo, the final chapter closes, and somewhere in Yorkshire, the memorials stand to 13 women whose names should be remembered not for how they died, but for who they were before Peter Sutcliffe destroyed them, whose lives mattered more than his crimes, whose memories deserve to be honoured and preserved and spoken aloud so that they are not forgotten, and so that their deaths continue to teach lessons about violence and about justice and about the responsibility we all share to protect each other from those who would harm us.